But there's no accounting for love, is there? That's the trouble. And you can choose someone nice, and then I do think we tell a lot of very bad stories about love.
As an
Emma
Oscar
Thompson.
for acting, another for writing, and a career most performers would trade everything for. But for years, the private story behind her public triumph stayed mostly out of view. The story of a marriage that collapsed in public, a heartbreak that made her question her own worth, and the quiet, unglamorous man who eventually helped her feel whole again. Now, in her late 60s, she has spoken more openly than ever about that chapter, and what she has said reframes almost everything people assumed they knew about her. Long before any of that heartbreak, there was Kenneth Branagh. The two met in 1987 on the set of the wartime drama Fortunes of War, and the attraction was immediate. Both were classically trained, fiercely intelligent, and hungry for the kind of acting careers that don't come along often. 2 years later, in 1989, they married, and almost overnight, they became something more than a couple. They became a brand. The British press nicknamed them Ken and Em, and for a while it felt accurate. They acted together. Branagh directed several of the films they starred in, and audiences treated them as the closest thing British theater and film had to royalty. But being a symbol has a cost. Thompson and Branagh later admitted that the constant coupling of their names and headlines started to erode their individual identities. At certain points, they stopped doing joint interviews altogether, not out of any conflict, but simply to remember who they were separately from the Ken and Em story the public had written for them. It was a small, telling sign that the fairy tale version of their marriage was already more complicated than it looked from the outside. As the years went on, the pressures that quietly undo many marriages began to show up in theirs too. Both actors were in constant demand, which meant long stretches spent apart on different productions, in different countries, living different lives. When the marriage officially ended in 1995, the explanation given to the public was almost exactly that their careers had pulled them in opposite directions for too long. It was a tidy, believable answer. It was also incomplete. There was more happening beneath the surface. Thompson has spoken since about wanting to become a mother during those years, and about how much the relentless pace of two demanding careers made that harder to imagine. By the time the marriage was in its final stretch, she has described being profoundly worn down, spending time away resting and recovering from exhaustion, at a point where she had little emotional energy left to give. The fuller story came out alongside the divorce. In 1994, Branagh had directed and starred in a film adaptation of Frankenstein, opposite the actress Helena Bonham Carter. Over the course of filming, what began as on-screen chemistry became something real off-screen. Branagh was involved with Bonham Carter, and Thompson had not known. What has struck people most in the years since is not just the affair itself, but how honestly Thompson has talked about being blindsided by it. She has said plainly that she simply did not see it, that she was, in her words, completely unaware of what was happening around her, and she has since reflected that this kind of blindness is less about being naive and more about how easily a person can talk themselves out of noticing something they cannot bear to be true. It's a strikingly self-aware thing to admit, and it's part of why her account of this period feels less like celebrity gossip and more like something a lot of people going through their own betrayals can recognize in themselves. She has also spoken about the emotional aftermath in unusually stark terms, describing a period where she felt reduced, as though whatever had made her feel worthy of love had disappeared. Hearing that from someone with 2 Oscars and a public life full of accolades is a reminder that professional success buys no protection at all against private devastation. The part of this story that sounds almost too neat to be real is how Thompson met the man who would eventually become her second husband. Greg Wise was a working British actor who, before landing his role in the 1995 adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, had a conversation with a friend who told him, as something of a joke or a genuine prediction, depending on who's telling it, that he would meet the love of his life on the set of his first major film. Sense and Sensibility happened to be the very film Thompson had written the screenplay for, adapting Jane Austen's novel while she was still processing the end of her marriage, and in which she was also starring as Eleanor Dashwood. Wise arrived on set carrying that prediction with him, and by his own account, initially assumed it pointed toward his co-star Kate Winslet, who was playing the younger Dashwood sister, Mary Ann. He asked Winslet out. The date, by most accounts, went nowhere, pleasant enough, but without any real spark. What makes the story worth telling isn't the misconnection with Winslet, though. It's what came after. Winslet, having spent time around both Wise and Thompson on set, apparently saw something Wise had missed entirely. That the real chemistry wasn't between the two of them, but between Wise and Thompson. She encouraged him to look again, and let him know that Thompson's marriage was over. Whatever had been misfiring before suddenly made sense. None of this happened quickly, and it shouldn't have. Thompson was not in a place, emotionally, to fall into a new relationship right after a marriage ended. She has described that period as one of genuinely feeling unlovable, which isn't a state of mind that invites a whirlwind romance. It was only months after her divorce was finalized that she agreed to go on a date with Wise, and even then, the relationship developed at its own pace rather than rushing toward anything permanent. What Thompson has said about this chapter, looking back, is that two things brought her back to herself, her work and Greg. She has described him, in essence, as the person who gathered up what was left of her after the divorce and helped put it back together. Not by fixing her in some dramatic, cinematic way, but by being steady, patient, and present while she slowly rebuilt her own sense of worth. They dated for roughly 8 years before marrying in 2003 in the small Scottish town of Dunoon. A long runway by celebrity relationship standards, and one that suggests neither of them was in a hurry to repeat old mistakes. Thompson and Wise's daughter, Gaia, was born in 1999, conceived through IVF when Thompson was 39. But the more unusual and, by Thompson's own account, more formative addition to their family came later, when they met a young man named Tindebo Agaba, a former child soldier who had fled conflict in Africa and arrived in Britain as an unaccompanied refugee. What started as an invitation to Christmas dinner turned into something lasting. The couple eventually adopted him. Thompson has spoken about how raising Tindy changed her understanding of what refugees and asylum seekers face day to day. Language barriers, suspicion, the exhausting work of being seen as fully human by systems that are often inclined to doubt people first. Tindy has since built a career as a human rights activist working on behalf of refugees. And Thompson has spoken with evident pride about the value people like her son bring as citizens, precisely because they take nothing about safety or belonging for granted. Perhaps the most surprising thing Thompson has said publicly isn't about betrayal or heartbreak at all. It's about what she thinks love actually is. She has been remarkably blunt in describing romantic love as something close to a myth, one she thinks people should regard with real skepticism rather than faith. Long relationships, in her telling, are difficult and complicated by nature, and anyone expecting some permanent happily ever after state is likely to be disappointed. Coming from someone whose first marriage ended in public betrayal, that isn't cynicism so much as hard-earned realism. Greg Wise, for his part, has echoed a similarly unglamorous philosophy. Asked about the secret to a lasting marriage, his answer has amounted to little more than, you simply keep working at it. He's also pointed out something a lot of couples might find counterintuitive, that spending significant time apart, rather than eroding a relationship, can actually help sustain one. The two of them are often away from each other for work for months at a stretch, and rather than treating that as a problem to solve, Wise has described it as something they've simply gotten good at managing, reconnecting deliberately each time rather than assuming closeness will take care of itself. Wise has also never seemed threatened by his wife's considerably larger fame and income, which by his own admission is real. Instead of competing with it, he's spoken cheerfully about years spent doing other work he loved, including manual labor, and has downplayed his own acting career entirely. That lack of ego, more than any grand romantic gesture, may be one of the quieter reasons a marriage has lasted as long as it has. What may be most remarkable about how Thompson has processed all of this isn't that she found new love. It's that she seems to have genuinely let go of the old wound. She has spoken about turning her early heartbreak into material for her work, most famously in the film Love Actually, where her character's quiet, devastating discovery of her husband's betrayal became one of modern film's most recognized depictions of private grief. Thompson has said she drew directly on real experience of that scene, the specific, practiced motion of falling apart privately and then composing herself to face the world again. And when it comes to Brannon Bonham Carter specifically, Thompson has described reaching an actual, lasting peace rather than a performed one. She's talked about no longer having any interest in holding on to resentment, has spoken warmly of Bonham Carter, and has even joked affectionately about what she and Bonham Carter might have had in common that drew Branagh to both of them. All three actors, Thompson, Branagh, and Bonham Carter, went on to appear together in the Harry Potter film series and have remained on good terms, which is its own quiet testament to how far Thompson moved past what once nearly broke her. These days, Thompson and Wise divide their time between London and a home in Venice, a city Thompson has long been drawn to and where she has been learning the language with the same enthusiasm she seems to bring to everything else. She has described her 60s as the best decade of her life so far, full of curiosity rather than regret, and entirely at odds with the version of herself who once felt, in her own words, only half alive. Taken as a whole, the story isn't really about a psychic's prediction or a mistaken first date, charming as those details are. It's about a woman who was knocked down hard enough to question her own worth, and who slowly, deliberately, with the help of one steady and unglamorous man, built something more durable than the fairy tale she'd once been part of. At 67, looking back on nearly 3 decades with Greg Wise, Emma Thompson doesn't describe it as a rescue so much as a partnership she and Wise have simply kept choosing one ordinary day at a time.